and welcome back to Factorio. My name is Abugnasty. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about producing productivity modules. Now, we're doing this specifically with Purple Science in mind. I'm hosting right now a competition on crafting Purple Science on Novice, and the competition's main goal is to make Purple Science as UPS efficiently as we possibly can. Productivity modules is going to be one of the items on our journey as we continue on with this monster series going into this, so enjoy the deep dives as we get into that in the rest of the video. At a high level, what I'll tell you first is this is one of the designs that's going to benefit the most from direct insertion. One thing that's just to give you an example though real quickly, in terms of costs of how expensive is producing the electromagnetic in an electromagnetic plant, the productivity modules compared to, let's say, furnaces, is about this ratio here. So from testing right now, producing 40 of the electric furnaces per second is equivalent to roughly about 80 per second. So really, in terms of the overall cost of Purple Science, this is about 2 times the cost in terms of UPS, even as efficient as we possibly can make it. So the benefits that we get from designs that are using just, in this case, it makes a lot of sense to go and use direct insertion for this, or some concept of chaining with either with cars, or in this case, as you can see with the steel chest, is really useful because we're going to need both red and green circuits for productivity modules, so you might as well get a ratio where these buildings are going to benefit from that. And also, one of the other benefits is just how close red circuits are to the actual productivity modules that we need. So these two buildings very closely can actually produce the amount of items just by themselves. With 2 buildings, we can get to the point where we can actually produce the amount that we need for Purple Science. However, one of the things you're going to see very prominently in these builds is going to be the concept of chest chaining. And the reason for that is just due to the number of beacons you're going to need. This is a ratio that is producing over 13 items per second. So the reason this is chosen is because 3 of these, and this is a very common layout, is going to produce 40 items per second once you have 10 beacons surrounding the actual electromagnetic plant. There's a secondary configuration that some designers have gone for, which is about 5 beacon layout. And so you can see kind of the diminishing effect that you get or return from beacons, right? As they wind up scaling, you get that kind of transmission strength is reducing over time. So this doesn't create a 2x increase, it creates virtually about 30% increase. But the reason this is beneficial at this point is because we can get, with 3 buildings, we can get 40 per second, versus over here, we need 4 buildings for that. So then that's an increase in the number of inserters and buildings to directly insert into here. However, like I said, direct insertion, and I'll tell you right away, this is going to be our best fundamental layout, and actually one of the best designs that we have right now after many iterations is effectively just this concept. So, however, this concept makes a lot of sense just because of the number of beacons that we can get around electromagnetic plant, and then we can also, the number of beacons that we can get around the red circuit production as well. So now you have to compromise a little bit with direct insertion on the number of beacons that you can get around a building. So one of the compromises, again, to get around that is using a 3-tile like this inserter. So you can use this with inserters. You could use a car in between. I have, just as a quick recap here over in Visual Studio Code, this was one of the videos that I recently released, but I did a deep dive on chest chaining using this concept here. And the best kind of chest chain, if you're using a 5-tile layout, just as a recap, was going to be just using a chest. There was no real difference that we found in the chest type, but cars were inferior in terms of this concept here. Now, where it can come into play, that is where it is useful, is in the concept where you're doing a 7-tile chain. So if you are chaining from one item to the next like this, so using 3 inserters, going down to 2 is better when you're using a car. So that is a concept that we're going to explore in this video today. So this is also going to prove that this is better, but there are some side effects that I didn't talk about in the first video because I wasn't aware of them, that we will see in this video, and if you wind up going looking at that. So if you stay tuned for the rest of it, in other words. So just a TLDR, what that actually means, it's very important when you're interacting with a car to clock both the input and the output inserter. Because one of the things that we've seen, and I'm assuming this is the case as I haven't been able to prove it, but I think even if you disable the car, this inserter is still going to be constantly active because the car could, quote, potentially move. So this is, again, we're abusing the mechanics of the game. I'm not expecting a developer to go and change this, right? But the point is that I'm saying is that this inserter still thinks the car could move, so I have to constantly scan and make sure the car hasn't moved from its current location. So clocking this inserter is very important. However, in the case of chests, it's actually better if you have constant back pressure. You always have an item being produced in the actual machine, pretending this is a machine here, to actually not clock these two inserters and only clock the lead inserter, so that these just rely on wakeless, because there's an overhead from the circuit network just connecting entities in general. So what I'll say is this design concept that you're seeing on the right here is going to be superior. However, with that being said, there's going to be some designs that still use this concept as well. No tanks were harmed in the making of this video. So that's enough of an intro. I'll go through some of the designs and the results, and we'll do a deep dive afterwards on some of the core concepts and the lessons that we learned. All right, so let's get into the designs. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the designs in terms of how they actually performed. So from left to right is going to be the performance, and that's also going to be indicated by the graphs I'm going to show here next. The main things that I want to kind of just point out right from the beginning is the way that I name things. So if you see 160 in front, that means the design itself was a 160 per second design. It was all inclusive, and this is what number of copies that we wound up creating was just based off this. If you see something like 40, that's going to mean that this is an individual copy that is created like this in general, and then I wound up hooking the same number of infinity loaders and infinity pipes up to it to produce a 160 per second build. In every single build, the way that I've designed them is I have this small little flow rate controller, which is a very simple circuit that I wound up setting up, but it's a consumption emulator, and you can go here and you can set the target speed of how many items you want to grab per second. So it's 160 per second. That's set here by this little signal, so the set signal here. And then that's just going to control the timing of when these inserters are going to pick up. Main reason I'm doing that is that the production rate is consistent across all the builds, because there isn't a belt speed that would naturally just remove items at 160 items per second or 40 or 80, etc. So that's why I designed this little thing, so that way it's all controlled, because some of these overproduce. So a good number of these builds will be overproducing the number of productivity models that they need. As you can see here, this is constantly getting backed up and is getting backed up on here, and this is overproducing just ever so slightly. So, and since some of them are not exactly clocked perfectly, then this also helps to throttle them so that they are all producing the exact same output. Cool. So now that we've talked about that, let's go and talk about the results at a high level quick, and then we'll go into each individual large step and we'll showcase. So real quick, what you're seeing in front of you are the results. So here are the overall run distributions. If you haven't seen a box and whisker plot before, the whiskers are the outliers. The white little area here is going to be the median value, the ones, and then the median between the largest outlier that's out here, and then the largest outlier that's out here. So that's going to be the run distribution, and then you can see the couple outliers that are out there. So this, when you look at this initially, you can think about this as having a decent amount of noise. Really, in perspective though, this is a range of 1.5 milliseconds down to 1.1 milliseconds. This is a 400 millisecond delta. So the differences in the designs here, you're going to see that there's going to be sometimes where they perform worse, sometimes they perform better. I have, over the experience that I've gained just doing so many benchmarks, this kind of just comes down to luck of the draw in which CPU core is going to get hit. So for that reason, I've implemented in terms of I wrote some code so that I can start filtering out these really high outliers. So what I've done is I've started to filter out the runs that are 2 standard deviations greater than the mean, and then 1 standard deviation greater than the mean. So you can choose both of these. For the actual results in this, it didn't make any difference in terms of their total placement, but just for clarity, this is going to be what I'm using. I'm using 2 standard deviations and less than that, so from the mean, so that's going to be the ones that we're using. So what does that translate to in the actual design time? So what you're going to wind up seeing here are a couple of larger steps. So the first ones, just to kind of point out here, are going to be there is a obvious difference that comes from the first 2 designs to the third design. Then there is a step in terms of the design that I wound up creating. And then you see another step here from 80 guys to 80 Swift. And then a final, like very, very small gradual changes till finally we get the 160 design by Ascara and the final design that Ascara iterated on. So out of the designs that were originally submitted in the competition, are going to be the designs here from Thaon all the way down to the very first place here, or the worst performing down on the bottom. Now, with that being said, I worked with the original designers for the Purple Science series, and we wound up iterating and making some improvements, and so that's what you wind up seeing here. That's why you also see the designers' names getting mixed in between, because they've worked together on this, which is actually really cool to go and see. So now, in terms of their performance difference, is just what I'll say is the first jump that you wind up seeing is going to be a 6% decrease, or like a 6% improvement. Then you're going to see an 8% improvement that comes from that. And then everything from there, and you're seeing here these little relative percent differences. These are going to be, you're going to see one more, like I talked about right there with Geist design to Swift Death's design, and you're going to see that 3% drop. And then everything beyond that is in the 1% deltas. So for a total span, right, coming from the design right here. So this is a total of like basically 6% difference until we get to the final 3% increase. So we'll talk about each of those individual ones, but I'll guide you along the way as we go through these, but just want to give you a high level overview. One thing before we get into the designs that I will point out really quickly, you can see that kind of the spread here, kind of tick-tock pattern going between entity time and control time. Clocking is so critical for this particular build, especially for direct insertion, and you can really get it wrong, as I've done. You can see mine is one of the worst performing designs. It's bad for a couple of reasons, but it is one of the reasons. It's just the clocking wasn't perfect. And so you can see like the best designs at the very top are the ones that you can see these top 3 designs here. They wound up having extremely similar entity time and actually very similar layouts. Just the clocking was painstakingly perfected by Aqara to get to this point. So hats off for getting that accomplishment. So let's go through the actual designs now. The first 2 designs are actually performed extremely similarly in terms of their overall performance. So when we compare this again here on the left, on the little pop-up window here, these are going to be these 2 designs that you're seeing here. So they perform extremely similarly, even though this one's using a decent amount of clocking and also a good amount of direct insertion. It's kind of an interesting design, like a kind of comparison here, because you're seeing here that the red circuits being belted and a decent clocking setup can actually be as good as an unclocked direct insertion build. Now, this is mainly due to a couple factors, but I'm just pointing that out as an initial observation that I thought was kind of interesting, is that they wind up having this behavior where, yeah, this one makes sense why it's going to be performing not as good as the other ones, just because it is suffering from the fact that it's belting red circuits. But it kind of makes sense initially because you can say, well, I can make a really good compact build that's going to be making the red circuits here locally, and then I would belt it to wherever I want to go and produce the electromagnetic plants and then the green circuits as well. But they're all kind of sharing the same fluid, so a lot of people, this is the only design that wound up actually belting it, and the rest actually wound up doing direct insertion. But the reason that if you look at these 2 designs here, they perform extremely similarly, but the main reason that this design suffers is from the fact that there's no clocking whatsoever. There's a lot of updates that are going on, and that's specifically because these 2 buildings are so closely out of phase all the time. So when I say that, what I mean by that is like the production of this is pretty much constant, and this inserter is picking up 1 item at a time. That's super expensive. This is constantly active, so all these inserters are constantly active, and then you can also see that in terms of the entity time, that this design is, as you can see here on the left, has an extremely high entity update time in total across the design itself. So now, if you look at this design in comparison to the original one, you see that, okay, the entity time is much higher, right? Because of just those inserters always being active. So the clocking really helps with the design here that is on the left. You wind up seeing that the clocking is helping out greatly in reducing the overall entity update time. Now the control update time basically kind of balances that out, even though they have very similar transport line update time. And then the electric network update time is a little bit higher, which makes sense just due to the overall counts of entities. That's usually where electric network update time comes from. So that makes sense. But then overall, that's where you're kind of seeing this balance. And really, they're performing extremely similar. So just interesting to point out for these. Next, let's go to the first larger increase and go to the design by McMahon 57. So the next 3 designs share a very similar strategy. What they're doing is they are chaining a lot more items to the individual, like the red circuits. And actually, every single one of these use a different chaining method. So here for McMahon, he's using a cargo wagon. I wound up using cars for this to transport the copper cables and the plastic. And then Geist wound up going and using steel chests for this. Now, with that being said, they all perform very similar. Now, there is a difference between these. So you wind up seeing that McMahon's design chooses to clock specifically only a few inserters. So it's in clocking the inserters that are coming from the foundries here into the green circuit build, and it's also clocking then the output coming from the productivity module. And the rest are left unclocked except for the red circuit that is coming out of this building. So just kind of just doing the outputs, right? So the downside to that is just the number of scan and wake lists that you wind up seeing here. So there's a constant kind of like flickering that's going on very quickly. So when you think about this, just real quick in terms of like production rate, this is going to be is 13 1/3 per second. So that means that you're going to have let's just make it simple. We'll just say every 15 ticks or so, you're going to wind up having an update. It's a little bit more than that, but just bear with me on the rounding error there. So that means about 15 times it's going to go and check something. And then the red circuits here are going to check even more frequently than that because each individual craft is going to be closer to about 45 or so ticks per second because it's constantly crafting, right? So that's like 45 scans there. So in terms of like the ones that clock, definitely all the inputs going into the red circuit building makes like total sense. And then also the ones that are going in here. So unfortunately, these were not clocked, and that's where you see this one winds up performing a little bit worse. And in fact, just to showcase that, if you look at this right now, so the design that we're looking at here is McMahon's, and you see the designs by Geist and myself. So we wound up clocking those more higher expensive items, and that's why they just wound up performing better. In fact, you wind up actually seeing that out of those two designs by Geist and myself, they almost perform exactly the same. They are a 0.05% difference. So let's talk through those designs quickly. So my design is, I used cars because I thought it was kind of a fun concept. One of the things that I regret about this is just that I didn't spend the time to actually get the clocking right. I spent way more time actually writing a script to try to auto-generate all these clocks for me, so it just would generate the blueprint of all the clocks that I would need. And in actual code, than I actually spent on trying to refine the design. So that's on me, right? Just focusing on the wrong thing. But getting the clocking is really hard, and I've really realized that through that exploration, so it was kind of useful. Now, the items that we're doing, one of the things that I wind up, and I'm just going to point out here because it'll be useful. The reason I'm choosing to use 4 here is so that there's a multiple of 16. So if you have, like 400 items divided by 16, that is a perfect integer, and that's going to be the first one where you're going to see that in terms of the stack size. So doing that allows this inserter to always output and never get blocked. That's one of the decisions that McMahon did not do, is he did in multiples of 200 and 100, and you wind up seeing that these inserters are always left with either 12 or 16 due to the rounding error of 200, right? So now you wind up seeing the same thing over here with Geist. He wound up doing that small little difference. This makes not a huge impact to it, but just kind of want to point out that that's a pretty simple UPS optimization that you could make, is just do this. Now, Geist is doing a really good thing, is he's not clocking the inputs. However, kind of have to clock the inputs if you're using cars. So one of the problems is that this seems to be constantly awake. So I'll prove that out here once we get to Thalen's design, but I just wanted to prove that out. Like, it's better to clock the inputs that are going into the car than it is to keep them just active. But when you're using chests, on the other hand, and you're seeing that here, I'm purposefully only clocking the outputs. That's a better choice to make in terms of what you're going to clock. So just letting this rely on a wake list is good, because it's just going to just run and be naturally in sync with this anyway. So there's no reason in adding an overhead for the clock here. So, and Geist recognized that, and that was a good choice here. And actually the interesting part is that just the number of inserters that are being used here to craft 80 items per second, which is the target for this particular build, is going to be 82 inserters. And you wind up seeing actually on my design that there are 148 inserters. So this one has more inserters overall, but winds up performing better just due to the fact that some good choices were made. So direct insertion here. This is a decent choice because of the weird timing that you get between these two buildings. So I understand why chesting it makes sense. So I just wound up using a chest chain that pulls out from green circuits, goes into a car, and then from the car back and forth into this red circuit assembly machine. And if your clocking isn't exactly perfect, although these were, which is great, these weren't, and so you just see a lot more just wakeless and constant scans of the inventory that's in here. So that wasn't absolutely ideal with my design. And so just more poor choices from my side, but then also it kind of balances out with Geist design, even though he has more inserters. One last thing that I'll point out is Geist design is actually not using traditional clocks. It's actually using a latching lead follower, and it works out really well. You see this kind of pattern of going between the latching lead follower design and going into inserter clocking between all the designs in this competition. So it's still very competitive here at this particular scale and at this UPS kind of output here. So kind of interesting to see. So those are the first three designs where you're seeing kind of that common pattern in terms of what their usages are. And in terms of their actual performance differences, you wind up seeing that Geist and Mine perform literally almost exactly the same, 0.05% difference. And then McMahon's design wound up just coming in a little bit short at a 8% decrease from one design to the other. So it just kind of goes to show just choosing the right things to clock can be really, really beneficial. And knowing which ones to clock, again, just kind of that rule of thumb. If it's less than 2 items or so per second that you're going to be transferring in and out of the machine, that's going to be or less than 2 wakeless that you see per second, that's going to be one that you probably don't want to clock. And if you see higher than that, it's probably worth clocking. So, and especially if it's much, much higher than that. Next design is an 80 per second design by Swift Death. Compared to the designs we've just seen, this is a much, much simpler build. So this is using fully direct insertion everywhere that's possible and is clocking almost exactly everything. Now the clock is not exactly perfect, as you can see with the wake list here, but still, this just goes to kind of show that like just doing direct insertion for this build and getting the clock close can make already a 3% improvement. And I pretty much guarantee that the time that it would take to design something like this is going to be a lot less time than potentially this here, especially with all the wires that you wind up having to route. And I can say just from personal experience here that this took way too long for the design. And ultimately, compared to these two designs here, this was 3% better. So kind of like choosing what you're going to do and what you're going to choose is going to be a kind of a critical thing. But investing time in a good clock makes a lot of sense. Now, if you look at this is actually a very similar design to the first one that we wound up seeing here by Tease. So using full direct insertion everywhere, however, having no clocking at all. So just to put that into perspective, if you look at these two designs here, the design that we're currently looking at, which is the one here by Tease, has a extremely high entity update time due to no clocking. But then the moment that you go over here and you look at this design here, you can see that this design has a huge drop off in terms of its entity update time. And that comes mainly from just clocking things and choosing the right things, again, to clock and just using direct insertion. So it kind of goes to show that, like, if you look at these designs, let me double check and look up what the performance difference was. So for the design that is in front of us by Swift Death, that wound up being 9% worse than the best design. And the design that we just showed was 30% worse. So a 20% improvement between those just purely by clocking. So kind of an interesting thing just to point out, so looking at these. Otherwise, this design did, like I said, a number of things right. Where it just kind of performs a little bit worse is just purely the fact of the number of beacon sharing. And if some of the later designs did a little bit better job of tiling the number of beacons that are going around the buildings to better share those, and then ultimately share one clock for a lot more. So this is, again, the number of clocks that are here is one for 80 per second, and then the rest of the clocks later on are now more in the 160 per second. Again, kind of some things to point out there. The rest of the designs now, when we go from the design that we're looking at right now here by Swift Death, and then as we continue to go up, we see that out of the original submissions, this is the design by Swift Death here on the right, this is the design by the End, and then ultimately the design by Thalon. These were the original submissions, and they're extremely close. These three top designs are within 1% of each other, so they're an extremely similar performance characteristic to each other. So these were ultimately the three top designs that were originally submitted. Now, I'm going to take a quick pause and specifically talk about Thalen's design because it made me really curious about that chest chaining concept that I talked about before. So, in this design, at the time when it was created, was before I did my deep dive into cars. So, with that being said, Thalen was really curious about it and said like, hey, okay, let me submit also a design that has cars in it. But initially it performed worse, which made me really wonder, like, what the heck is going on? Why is it performing worse when we had benchmarks running before that obviously proved that it was better to eliminate this extra inserter and instead wind up dropping a car here so that you can just have 2 inserters? Well, we figured out a really interesting thing. So what I wound up doing is I created 3 copies of the same design. The first design is exactly what Thalen originally submitted, which you're seeing here, which has a buffer of the green circuits. This is unclocked going into it. The second one that I wound up doing was I said, okay, well, let me go and clock the inserter inputs because that's what I was doing for my car build because I was just curious about it. So you wind up seeing that these are both clocked going into this. One of the things you're going to notice when I press F5 here is you're going to see that there's no wake list because these are clocked perfectly. Whereas this one is constantly has this little blue indicator here and is pulsing on and off. Now, the final design that I wound up saying was, okay, well, does the number of slots matter? Because the moment that you go and clock both of them, well, there's no point anymore. We don't need this buffer because they're both going to insert at the same time. This one's always going to lead, pull the items out, and always going to make room for the next one, even if it backs up. So then I said, okay, let's go and eliminate it and just bring it down to 1 slot and see what the difference in performance is. So let me go pull up that chart and I'll show you actually the exact difference between these 3 designs. So now looking at the results here, this was the original submission by Thalen, which performed worse than his original design. You wind up seeing here by clocking the input, we saw a huge improvement, which made us kind of wonder, like, why is that happening? So our best concept right now is that the inserter that's pulling items into the car is constantly scanning to check if the car's going to go drive off, even if you disable it via script. So that's probably what's going on. And then finally, I wound up seeing that it got a little bit better by just only having 1 slot. In my original tests that I did, I had them constantly running, so I wouldn't have seen this edge case. This was a good kind of point to bring up and kind of show here for this. So the next item that I'll show is kind of the entity update time. So if you look at this right now here, so the original design that Thalen had was actually, this was a 4% difference. So in relative scale, this mattered actually in the overall designs that you wind up seeing. So you can kind of see here, this was Thalen's original design, and you can wind up seeing how it improves and is higher than the original design that he had just by using the best car design that we could come up with together. So, but it was interesting that having just 1 slot was better, and having a second slot was a little bit worse, but the definite like difference overall between these two, the design that had the clocking done on both sides proved to be better. So it seemed to be beneficial in that counterintuitively to the way that chests usually work. So that's where we see like the larger change, and then just having the 1 slot wound up being a little bit better, which was just interesting to kind of see that all these designs compared to all the rest of them were all started exactly in the exact same tick. So power was turned off and then everything started up together. And then the first like 3,600 ticks were removed just so that they were all be at steady state. And so you wind up seeing that that performance difference did matter for those and from those inserters themselves. So if we go back to Factorio now and I kind of showcase that, the main differences then, like I said, was those clocking methods that were used. But what's interesting to me is that now by eliminating kind of that little blue scanning, again, like the best guess that we have right now is just the fact that when it's in this consideration, in this state, even though this is saying that this is, quote, disabled by that little red icon there, and you can see that there is, I'll pause this here. You can see that right now this is saying it's disabled, but there's still a good number of wake up lists. And you can see that when it winds up transitioning and going away, it doesn't have some of the other some of the debug signals that these have over here. You can see that this is disabled by control behavior. This is waiting for source items. So it's waiting for this and is subscribed to that. So it shouldn't be looking at this. But we think something else is going on where it winds up just being better by clocking it. So there might be behavior where it's checking if the car has moved and if this target, which is now dynamic, has left. So that's mainly our hunch with that. So that's a little bit of an interesting thing on cars, just so that you guys can all understand what we're talking about there. Okay, so from now on, these are all designs that were designed post the original submissions. So let's get into those next. So next, let's talk about the rest of the designs here. These are designs that I'm calling the 1% Club. These were all designs that were submitted after the original submissions that were created for Purple Science, so many weeks afterwards, when many of the designers have worked together on these designs, so there's been a lot of cross collaboration, which is really cool to see. But where I'm saying that these improvements are going to get diminishing returns is if you look at right now the displays and the values that you're seeing over there on the left hand side, the distribution right now between the version you're seeing here in front of you on the right, which is designed by Warbecue, to the design here by the Flying Curryfish is a 3% difference. So the differences between each design is less than 1% as we go up here. So very, very small differences. Takara has a jump of 3%, which I'll explain here at the end, but you wind up seeing this kind of like distribution here. So very, very, very small differences. Now, all these designers have come up with really complicated clocks to compensate for a problem that I want to talk about now, which is around a concept called an overload multiplier. So the overload multiplier, what is that? So I'm going to hover over this building here, and you're going to wind up seeing a couple things. You're going to see that there is an automated insertion limit of plastic bars, which is 34, 68, and then 34 again. So how does that number come up? And why is this currently in a situation where it's output blocked, right? There's no inputs. Why is this currently right now having this little yellow icon and has no items that we can take out of it? The first thing, if I press F5, you can get this little debug menu. You want to know how you can get that yourself? Go in, press F4, go to the debug settings, and enable the show debug infos in tooltips. So by hovering over this, we could wind up seeing now that the overload multiplier is 17. 17 times 2 plastic bars for every red circuit is going to be 34. Times 4 for 17 is going to be copper cables, so that's going to be 68, and so forth. So that's just the overload multiplier, which is based on the speed of the machine, and you can actually calculate this yourself if you want to. But the main point is that that overload multiplier itself, you can just look at it by the hovering over it, and that number is going to dictate how many items you can actually have on the inputs. Now the output, and this is something that I didn't quite realize until this video here that I'm recording, is also has its own internal restriction. So you can figure out when the output block is going to happen. Now it's not exactly the overload multiplier. You can see here that we have 20. The reason this occurs is because you can see here that this is 34 items. So the moment that it drops below 34, we're going to put 16 items into here. So we could have, at any moment in time, let's say this consumes 4 items in that time, so then it would be 56 or 46 total items that are in there. So 46 divided by 2 is going to give us 23, and then we multiply that by the productivity, which is 175%, and then that's going to give us 63 items, so that we're going to wind up getting out of this. So we could, in theory, have 63 items here on the output if we get the timing exactly right. So then that would mean that how many times can we actually pull out a stack of 16? Well, that's going to be almost 4 times that we can do this. So in theory, you should be able to get this to fully fill up to the 64 items or that we saw. However, if you think about how long does it take for you to create a buffer of 64 items, well, on this particular machine, this is only going to be 35 items per second. So that means it's going to be almost 2 seconds that this is crafting. So you're never in practice going to let it be able to actually back up that high, because you're going to be limited by how many swings you can transfer into the electromagnetic plant, because this has an automated insertion limit of 50. So we might be able to cram all of those items in there in time, but now you're dependent on the second condition, which is the output block of this machine. So there's a condition in which this happens. So right now, if you look at this, the overload multiplier is 10. So technically right now, even if we enabled these inserters, and even though this is under the automated insertion limit, we still can't put items in here, because the second condition that will block any assembly machine from going and inserting more items on the input is based on the items that are currently on the output. So for recipes that only produce one item, it's going to be directly the overload multiplier. So whenever there's 10 items in this assembly machine, we're not going to be able to insert any, or 10 items or greater, we're not going to be able to insert any items on the input. If this was like producing 2 items per craft, then at an overload multiplier of 10, this would then have 20 that would have to be on the output for this to happen. But it's basically the number of crafts. That's the way to think about it. So if you have 10 crafts, after 10 crafts with an overload multiplier of 10, you're going to have no more the ability to put items in here. So those two different forces are impacting the window in which you can actually insert anything actually into the building itself. So because that happens, there's an extremely tight window between these two machines where you can actually do that. And that's why so many designers have opted for having this buffer chest in between, because I've done the math actually, which I'll show here in a second. You can't actually do this. There is no way for you to actually buffer the items that you would need inside this and get the timing right, because they're out of phase constantly with their crafting cycles. Let me explain that here. So what you're seeing in front of you here is the kind of mumblings of a madman. I wound up trying to create a almost finite state machine to try to craft and figure out the exact machine state, crafting progress, the bonus progress. I was basically trying to simulate what the machine is actually doing every single tick. I didn't make it enough to actually showcase it for this video, and actually I pivoted greatly. It was originally designed for me to be able to auto compute all the clocks. I just didn't quite get there. And so this is now just turned into an way over engineered machine stats calculator. So that sometimes happens in software engineering. You wind up going and having to pivot in the middle because you realize that the thing that you were trying to clock is actually impossible, at least in the way that you were originally doing it. So anyway, so with that pivot, I have a bunch of really nice machine stats over here. So the whole goal of this was I wanted to be able to actually pull directly from the the data that you can get by running a dump command from Factorio and get all of the recipes in the entire game. So all 40,000 lines of JSON here. And then I just wanted to basically say here, hey, I'm going to get a configuration. I want a recipe that I'm going to choose, which is productivity modules. I want a target in items per second and the number of machines that I have. I wanted to then pull all the different ingredients, all the ratios and all that, and figure all those stuff out for me. The second thing that I wanted to say was configure the amount of machines that I have, so productivity modules, electronic circuits, advanced circuits, etc., and then all the inserters, where they're going from and going to. That's what I wanted to say, what their stack size is, and then I'm assuming every single component is legendary from then on, so at least for the inserters. So all that being said, if you take the crafting speed, you can actually figure out what this overload multiplier is. So let's take productivity modules, for example. If you're interested in that, the way that that kind of works is there is a calculation that the game does. The way that the overload multiplier is actually calculated is this magic number. So there's this dynamic recipe overload factor of 1.166. This is a magic number, and this is directly copied from one of the developers from Factorio and from the source code. This is representing the maximum number of seconds it takes for a base game inserter to do one cycle, to do anything. So that's a yellow inserter. Right? That's how long that takes. So the way the overload multiplier is calculated is the number of crafts we can complete during one inserter's full swing plus one. So that's what you're kind of seeing here. So I take like that constant value, that 1.166, I divide that then by the energy required. That's the number of seconds it takes for that particular item to be crafted based on the recipe. So that's what that energy required means. If you're a mod the game, you would know what that is. And then otherwise divided by the crafting speed. So the crafting speed is the value that you see on an actual item in the game. So if we open up Factorio for this, I'll get rid of my other windows that I no longer need. So if you look at this and you hover over it, you'll see that nice little crafting speed, right? So that's that crafting speed is 77.8, right? So that gives us here an overload multiplier of, we'll open this up. That's going to be 17 there. So you can kind of compute that, take 1.166 divided by the seconds it takes for this recipe. So this takes by default 6 seconds. So do that, 1.166 divided by the seconds it takes to craft. and then divided by the machine speed here, which is going to be 77.8. If I can do this right, 77.8. And that gives us 15 plus 1, which is 16, and then it rounds it up to the nearest number, which is going to be 17. So that's how the overload multiplier is calculated. Probably way more information than you actually need on how it's done, but that's actually how the game does it. The game kind of bases it around that, and it clamps it at 100. So you can see here, this is actually over 150 is actually what the overload multiplier should be, but it clamps it at 100 and says that's the maximum it can do. However, it doesn't take into account productivity, so productivity actually will make you reach that overload multiplier of 17 much faster. Because for every single item that you're crafting inside here, you're actually going to get 2.75 items for every one that you would normally get. That effectively reduces the number of items that are in here from 17 down to whatever that is. That's going to be about, if I've done the math there right, you'll reach it in a much shorter amount of time, right? So in 2.75 times the amount. So it's really about 6. That really is like you have a very short window in which this overload multiplier is going to get quickly hit. So you have very short swings that you can actually get the items into here while still being under that overload and limit. So all that being said, I will eventually maybe take some inspiration from 3 blue, 1 brown, so that I can create better visual for this, because that probably is better than me just showing some code. But I wanted to show that this is like, I wound up doing this because I was trying to get it so that we could just stop trying to clock things manually and just get to the point where we can just automate it. But I'm not quite there yet. This is a complicated problem, as I've hopefully explained deeply in this. So with that being said, that this is a very complicated problem, let's talk about all the designers who figured out how to actually get those clocks all completely right. Moving on to the next designs here. We've got the designs I'm going to talk through now are the designs from Warbecue, going all the way up to the Flying Curryfish 154, and I'll leave a Car Vortex for the end. So one of the things that I found kind of interesting is just the similarities, but there's some slight differences. Now, Warbecue's design here and Tease's design are exactly identical in terms of their performance in my mind. There's a less than 0.5% difference between these two. Now, there's a slight difference in the way that they're done. This is using chest chaining here, and then ultimately is producing per individual electromagnetic plant 10 per second. But then this design over here is instead, the compromise that it's making is pulling out 8 items per second. So it is going to be unloading those and dropping them out of it. Now it does that because you can't quite get the number of swings you need to constantly be running this, given the difference in their timing that they're outputting items. So you can't quite swing over here. You can overload initially, because when we talked about that 53 or so tick window that you have, it can throw a whole bunch of items in the very beginning, well before it gets over its overload multiplier, which you can see over here is going to be 10. And you can see that this is constantly on this side able to craft and bring out 16 items per second. Because we can put so many items in the beginning, while it's still under the automated insertion limit and while this is under its overload multiplier. On the right here, we don't get that same benefit because we can't quite stack as high the number of items from the advanced circuits here. So you can see that this is constantly swinging, bringing those items in one at a time, and then instead is meeting this halfway exactly and is pulling out items every 8 ticks instead. So that's kind of the compromise that's made to achieve that. And then they're both about the same in terms of their performance. Getting into Thalen's cars, we've talked about that one previously. This was ultimately the main benefits here is due to now we wind up going into a reduction in the total number of buildings. So you wind up seeing that for 40 per second we're using 3, whereas over here we are using 4. So that just comes down to just a reduction in the total number of buildings and entities and electric network update time, all that good stuff. So which you see over here as well. You can just see that. The difference here, electric network winds up being, technically a little bit similar, but overall control network goes down, there's less things that need to be clocked, and you can kind of see too, just like Warbecue's design and Thalen's are really close. Tease winds up being a little bit higher because it's using lead follower for this particular design, but then ultimately the net performance difference is that you can more closely see the difference between Warbecue's design and Thalen's design, that they wind up kind of having a drop overall just due to the number of buildings that are there. That's the main thing they can think of, because they're both of their clocks are very, very, very close to each other in terms of their control update time. Now, one of the things that I'll point out here with T's design is he is clocking every single one of the inserters. And as we agreed upon as a group, it is better to not clock the ones that are very, very slowly being used. So specifically the ones that are going into green circuits is not going to be all that useful to go and actually wind up clocking, just due to the low consumption rate of the inputs themselves, or at least the number of swings that you're going to prevent. So that's where, when Tease and Akara wound up working together, you wind up seeing that even though here you wind up seeing that there are no clocks, there's no circuit connected at all to the inputs that are going into electronic circuits. So that just winds up being an improvement there. Slight difference in terms of the layout overall, but you wind up seeing that now with the clocks that Akara made, and then removing the inputs here, even though these are, quote, showing wake lists, it winds up being overall better because they're so infrequently actually having this craft almost ever at all, just because of how fast it is. So then moving on to the next design here that Thalen and Akara Vortex wound up working together on, winds up just being an iteration from Thalen's original design, but then making slight differences in terms of like the beacon layout and the ratios, kept the exact same clocking that was there, but then ultimately just, this is like one of the things that I really like about this particular design and the original one from Thalen is just how nice this tiles. So that's one of the downsides to a lot of these other designs, is that they just cannot tile as nicely just due to the different layouts of how they've routed the items going around. So just from that perspective, purely sharing beacons immediately, you get to share 37 beacons. That's a huge benefit for going and stacking this, even though the benchmarks don't show that, because to make them all identical, I've created a version that is, 160 per second, and then I would clone them all uniquely. But that is something to be said for this particular build, is that it can improve if you're going higher in terms of the numbers that you need, because you can so easily stack these. So that's a huge plus in terms of the design overall. So both these designs I really like in terms of just their ability to easily go and get tiled. So if we go over here now to the design, the last in this particular segment from the Flying Curryfish, I found this one really interesting because it actually, in this design, their Flying Curryfish figured out a way to still get 16 items out of here, even though we can see our overload multiplier is still 10, like the other ones. And it's so using a kind of a clever kind of like fallback here, where it's just checking sometimes as a fallback, just in case it's not working, which will happen infrequently. There's a couple cyclers where it won't happen. But in general, most of the time, it's always picking up 16 items. And this is actually a really nice use case where like Latch Lead Follower can really shine. And so it gets around a lot of the complicated clocking logic that exists that I know most of the designers here have probably lost years of their life trying to go and get the clocking exactly right just due to it. So I'll spare you all those details, as I don't even fully understand how detailed or how hard the clocks were to get. But just showing kind of how simple these clocks are for like Latch Lead Follower. So it would like kind of check like how many productivity models do I have? Can I go and insert items? Yes or no? And it did a really good job. It still does multiple swings, and it's really close. And it actually puts it ahead just in terms of the other designs, just to some of the very simple kind of clocking. Now, it's still clocking a lot of things that I think are unnecessary. So for green circuits here, going in here. But so those are some things that I think we could improve on and just removing these. But just in general, I thought that was a really cool way to kind of get around some of those limitations, because there's a very explicit period where you can go and insert more items and try to get these two to sync up. You see that too, just even in the charts, that the design here that Flying Curryfish has a very similar entity update time to the last two designs from Akara Vortex. So I think actually there is a case to be made that if we remove some of the clocking of the unnecessary items that are on here, that this design could be, if not, could be even that much better, just due to the extra control update time that just doesn't need to be there. So with that being said, let's go and talk about finally the last designs that Akara Vortex created. So you wind up seeing here this design iteration that has kind of come about as we've gone through things. Akara Vortex wound up going and figuring out a bunch of kind of modulus subclocks that were needed, but again is making that compromise of pulling out 8 items and then dropping the last items here to get all 16 items out. So that's kind of that downside. So I'm really curious. I won't be testing it for this particular video as of just for the sake of time, as I'm already going to be a week or at least probably a day late to actually posting this. But this is interesting how close you can actually get with latch lead follower, and probably can save you a lot of the headaches of some of these clocks that need to be done. And I'll say that especially for the final design, that iteration that Aqara Vortex wound up working on. This is an extremely complicated clock. This has a very long cycle time to get everything to go and finally synchronize. And it takes about 20 minutes if you to fully get into a full rhythm and synchronize everything. So this is using here kind of a start stop. This is actually using lead follower for this particular output here, but then is clocking the rest of the inputs and has a short cycle where red is just not being used, and then green and red are going in together to kind of balance this this out overall. I frankly don't fully understand how it works. And that's one of the problems with the more complicated clocks, even the ones that I create, is that if I didn't create it myself, it's kind of hard to really fully understand it. But just at a high level, I know a lot of time was taken to exactly filter out specific odd ticks, because what this really does is it does like a 3 and a 1 swing pattern. So sometimes it swings 3, sometimes it swings 1, which you wind up seeing here, and occasionally it filters out the red items from those particular ticks where it shouldn't be running to kind of create that 3 1 3 1 pattern that you're seeing here. So really, really cool concept. Now, the difference between this design, which is the best one that I have in this particular round, versus the last design that Aqara Vortex made is, let's go and pull that up. If we look at these two designs, the total difference here, and I'll pull it up in my other chart here that I have handy, is a 0.1% difference. So probably, maybe it's not worth the extra time to go and figure out all the clocks, but man, it's still impressive to get that, to squeeze out that last tiny little bit. But with all that being said, I still think there's something to be said with, like, latch lead follower I wouldn't sleep on. I think there is a point to trying to figure this out and trying to continue to improve on this, because just the amount of information that you gain from a machine is so much that you can kind of avoid some of these more complicated clocking scenarios, and potentially just setting ratios, knowing about that overload multiplier that I said, knowing how many items you can actually put in, and just making sure that it's less than, you know, like you can keep on putting stuff in while it's under the overload multiplier. Like that might be a really nice way to kind of start improving on this, is just putting those numbers in and computing some of these clocks rather than the complicated clocking mechanisms. So further things that we can continue to explore and research as we iterate on it. I think there's some really good ideas that are coming from this, and I really want to just highlight that for a second, because it's a really, really cool way to do this. The only downside is just that it would sometimes stop because it would overproduce, because now it's not based on the machine, on the actual output that you need, but winds up being based on the machine speed. And here, this is just slightly overproducing all the time. That's a big reason why I added this kind of throttle, to make sure that as we're producing items, we're always constantly throttling the exact build so that it's more closely aligned with the rest of them, and that's what you see. So, with all that said, that's the last of the main items that I wanted to talk about in this particular design series. So let's go to closing thoughts, and I'll leave you with the takeaways that I said in the beginning of the video. So with all these designs, the main things that we saw here was that direct insertion was better. And overall, the main differences between whether you wind up using 8 buildings to produce 80 per second versus using 6 buildings to produce 80 per second wasn't a huge difference in overall. Where it really came down to was clocking things and clocking the right things. So the main items that really mattered in terms of clocking was clocking the high flow rate items that had constant, like very large wakeless items. So for the slow crafting items like this that need a lot of high inputs, those made sense to do. So the 15 to some up to like 45, 46 wake events that were happening, or 45 crafts that are happening, those made sense to clock. The ones that weren't worth clocking were the ones where this is very, very infrequently needing any items actually on the input at all, so that didn't make sense to clock. And then overall, it makes sense too, just looking at it from the very beginning, that belting red circuits wound up being a little bit worse. That makes sense. That's not going to be a newsflash here. The ultimately clocking makes a huge difference, as we saw from this design going up to the other design by Swift Death here that are very similar in terms of their overall layout. And ultimately, just as we continue to go up, you wind up just seeing again, like a 6% delta between all these these submissions that came in after the competition itself, and you wind up seeing slight refinements. So all just depends. And one thing that's again to remember, just that I took away from this video as well, clocking the inputs to cars matters a lot. So that's something that matters, and also the number of slots that you're using. So if you're going to do that, that's something just to kind of consider. And then the last takeaway that I would say here is that latch lead follower can be really, really good if you're choosing the right clock. And there might be something that we can continue to further explore as we go forward into, where's the actual latch lead follower design? Sorry, here. Into setting some of these inputs and outputs specifically around what the overload multiplier of the machine is. And that will help us get around those issues and just be able to probably figure out what these ratios are a little bit easier as well. So seems to be cool. So overall, and the last thing that I'll say as well is just to keep in mind that in terms of the overall performance characteristics, this is about half the UPS cost of what the furnaces were. So this is leading me kind of, again, more towards my current understanding that the biggest entity update time is going to come from how you are transporting the stone, because it's such a high resource item, and that's going to ultimately impact the final designs that we get into. So that's what I have today on productivity modules. I don't know exactly how long the video is, but I hope that it's if you did stick around to the end of this video, that I appreciate your attention span, and thank you for listening to all the things that I was talking about in this video. If you want to join some of the conversations, I have a Discord that I have in the video link below, and you can go check that out and talk with all the great designers that are here that you're seeing. And then ultimately, I will see you in the next video as we continue to explore Purple Science. So with all that said, thank you so much for watching. My name is Abucknasty. Have a fantastic rest of your day.